Being the truth, I've watched animals be dragged into that room and euthanized. Perfectly healthy, perfectly adoptable animals.
And I mean, what is your message though? Because again, from looking at this, it appears that this dog was fine, but then your records say it was euthanized for medical reasons. So you can understand why when the community looks at something like that, they may be concerned.
Well, in just 13 months, Columbia Animal Services euthanized about 1,000 dogs. But what has some concerned is why they are killing those dogs.
The shelter's own records show that many of those dogs listed as perfectly healthy, yet were killed within days of entering the shelter. Cynthia Beasley is investigating this story.
And Cynthia, I know you have gone through the medical records for hundreds of these dogs.
Yes, I have, and many of those records raise questions about whether the shelter is violating a state law, with some concerned they could be euthanizing missing pets.
And instead of just treating him, which would be easy, antibiotics, they decided to euthanize him.
This employee says this happens often at Columbia Animal Services. Healthy dogs being put down.
There was a pretty young pit bull mix named Vinny.
This employee says Vinny just had swelling on his face, something the employee says is treatable.
I watched that dog walk to the euthanasia room, wagging his tail, not knowing that he was about to die.
366 were euthanized the same day that they came into the shelter. That's 38% of the dogs euthanized. Are you surprised to hear that?
No, not at all.
Over a 13-month period, Columbia Animal Services euthanized 958 dogs. Almost half of those dogs were euthanized within 5 days. When WIS first started looking into this, the shelter provided us data showing the reason for euthanizing those dogs. Those reasons were overwhelmingly for behavioral problems or medical issues. The data says only 7 dogs were killed to create space in the shelter, but this employee says it's happening more often than that.
So you're saying this data is bogus?
Correct. Absolutely, 100%.
WIS then asked for those dogs' individual medical records. Those told a different story. I took this data to shelter superintendent Victoria Riles.
This dog, for instance, was at the shelter for 8 days. It says it was euthanized for medical reasons, but then if you look, this says normal. I mean, is there something missing in that data?
So this would be the initial intake examination, which could have been normal at the time, but over the course of observations, medical concerns have come to play, and a euthanasia decision would be made due to medical.
Where are the records, though?
There may not
to
always
support
be a
that?
record.
Here's another one, if you want to look at that. This one was euthanized, brought in the 7th, euthanized the 13th.
So yeah, again, in some of these, I don't know what the information that was redacted was.
Here's an example of that redacted information. The city cited that it's personal or private information, but the Freedom of Information Act allows government agencies to withhold certain private information about people, such as health records, but FOIA does not exempt animal health records.
So you can understand why when the community looks at something like that, they may be concerned.
I would say that, again, we are reevaluating the process. As we have gone through some of these records, we realize that we need to have an extra step in place to ensure that what transpired translates onto paper, as it has not always. We know that we are euthanizing within the rights of our ordinance if it is something that's on stray hold.
State law says shelters must hold stray dogs for 5 days unless the dog has severe medical issues or is dangerous. It's so if your dog runs away, you would have the chance to find them.
This one also not held for the stray period, doesn't have any medical conditions on that intake form. I mean, it looks like it's not following the stray hold laws from the way these documents are.
So per our ordinance, if there is a medical or infectious disease or an injury, again, that we cannot facilitate rehab of, we have the right to make the decision even if it's on stray hold. And we certainly would not bring something in that's in a state of suffering if we cannot facilitate easing that pain or suffering.
And I mean, that's understandable, but you know, this guy, negative for parvo, and again, you can see where the concern is. Like, are you guessing, like you're assuming that these dogs must have had severe medical issues that weren't documented?
I can assure you if we're euthanizing on stray hold, we're doing so with valid reason, and I am acknowledging that some of those reasons did not translate to paper, and we are reevaluating the process for that.
Stray holds aren't being done.
Felicia Lee used to volunteer in the shelter. She says she came in one day and saw 2 dogs in a crate. This is one of them. She says a shelter employee told her this dog was going to be euthanized unless it was out of the shelter by 5 p.m.
So she'd only been there 3 days.
3 days.
And the stray hold is 5 days.
Right. They were not aggressive. There were nothing medically wrong. The minute I brought her in here was fine. Like, curled up with my daughter. Well, she knew that's how to stay.
This dog is a lucky one, finding a new home to stay, while data shows others may never get that chance.
As for those behavioral issues touched on, in the 13 months, the shelter killed 532 dogs for that reason. 99 did not make it to 5 days in the shelter. Ryle says they are changing the way they test dogs' behavior to make it more fair to the dogs. Before, they would bring in dogs on leashes and see how they reacted. She said they did this, of course, for their employees' safety, but it's not always the best way to gauge a dog's reaction. But when it comes to saving more dogs, she says really they need the community's help to do that.
And especially when it comes to things like spaying and neutering, you know, we have very slack laws on that, so a lot of people don't do that. Also, there's always the option of fostering and adopting and trying to keep those animals. But there's a lot of help available to the shelters and to the community if people just tap into those resources.
And have the community want to help.
And a lot of advocates say that we do need to strengthen our laws in the state to have better outcomes. So